The Mind's Eye with DJ BJ Turnoff. It's available on all major platforms. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye, the intersection between history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, host of this auditorium of audacity. I know it's been a minute since you heard from us, maybe more than a few if I'm being completely upfront, but we got a hell of a slate of episodes over the next few months, which I'll tell you about at the end, along with the reason for the lack of episodes this year. But first, let me at least tell you what we got on the docket tonight, what's happening for this edition. After turning 40 last month, I guess you can say I'm feeling a little bit nostalgic. So when I came across the newest book, Bowie at 75, I had to get something on the books with the author for an interview. But the book itself, Bowie at 75, it examines David Bowie's extraordinary life through the lens of 75 significant career achievements and life events. Author of the book, veteran rock journalist Martin Popoff. He's going to join us and touch on a few of those moments for this show. Martin, as you could imagine, is a pretty big rockhead. He's published over 60 books on a variety of bands. So obviously we're going to delve into the music and artistic career of the iconic and beloved rock star. Collaborations with artists like Iggy Pop and Lou Reed, the Andy Warhol connection, and even touching on how his brother's suicide impacted his life and career, amongst many other stories. More information about him and the book is on our website, themindseyemedia.com. You'll also find links to over 120 plus episodes. If you like what you hear, please hit the donate button at the top of the website. And everyone who donates at least gets an episode that has never been aired, never been put in the archives, only for your ears, and some other great things that you could get. Again, visit the website, themindseyemedia.com. Now let's get the connection, turn off to Popoff. Let's welcome him, Martin Popoff, music journalist, award-winning documentarian, and prolific author. Thank you for joining us on The Mind's Eye.
Yes, thanks for having me, Brian. Very cool.
Before we talk David Bowie at 75, let's talk Martin Popoff at 59. What have you been listening to these days?
Wow, good point. Well, it's usually listening to things that I have to listen to in terms of, boning up on albums we're going to be talking about. So, for example, this morning it was AC/DC Flick of the Switch, because we've got our own YouTube channel called The Contrarians. So there we do various album rankings and dark horse things and, pick a contrarian choice for an album. So we're doing this AC/DC Flick of the Switch. And then tomorrow morning, one of our Contrarians Patreon subscribers started his own YouTube channel, and we're ranking the albums of The Damned. So I have to do that. And then I have to get prepared. I'm going to have a good buddy, Ralph Chapman, on Contrarians again. And we're going to do Pink Floyd, The Final Cut. So I got to listen to that again. Last week or 2 weeks ago, it was Peter Gabriel 2. And I've got my own audio podcast called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. So we just went through the senior singer report card, so I had to listen to a lot of that. But you're right, it's either Spotify for me or one of my 2 iPod classics, which plug into the car or jog with. And those are really the only, the physical media just sits there and it never actually gets used. It's just there to look at, kind of thing.
Anything contemporary? You listening to any new music?
No, I have a whole kind of weird philosophy around that. I'm trying to wrap my head around why I don't do that enough, but I'm still very curious about music, but it usually turns out that there's all sorts of old music as well, which has an extra level of curiosity to it, that I go explore bands that I missed at the time quite often. So I do a lot of that, it seems. Funny thing is, I ended up in this business, I suppose, simply by fate of being just such a massive, crazy music fan. So at 59, I would say I got heavy into music when I was about 9, 10, 11, by 11, somewhat of a music expert. But literally me and my buddies in Trail BC, we were all about the heavy stuff, right? So if it wasn't heavy, we didn't care, right? So we were just angry young metalheads for many, many years. So Bowie, not really until, my awakening and spreading out into other kinds of musics would have been about 1979. I remember, grade 12, going into university, all the university years and stuff. So, I would say probably around Scary Monsters is still my favorite Bowie album. So probably, right around that time, Lodge or Scary Monsters. First seeing Bowie was a really cool concert. It was in Vancouver, BC, the first concert at BC Place Stadium. So the new big dome that they had there. Mm-hmm. And it was the Tubes supporting Peter Gabriel on Security and then Bowie on Let's Dance. So, it was definitely a momentous concert because I love the Tubes a lot as well. So that was really cool.
The book opens with a great passage about Bowie. Quote, "It's a life for the arts, dedicated to the arts, often at the expense of personal relationships and even the health of the man, flinging himself to the ground in prostration to an insatiable muse." Extrapolate a little bit more on that statement.
Yeah, that was one of the cool things about Bowie, definitely all through his life. I mean, the guy was just a conduit of the arts. They just flowed into him and flowed out of him in various ways, and obviously the various types of art, including literally visual art, literally painting, right? But fashion, music, stage show, image, creating all these different personas all through his life, and yeah, essentially, it's like there's the infamous cocaine and milk and green peppers era, right? You think of Jimmy Page and living on orange juice and vodka or whatever, how skinny he got and all that sort of thing, right? So literally at the expense of proper nutrition and definitely drugs and booze and all that kind of stuff. But mostly drugs, I would say. But also definitely personal relationships and just this idea that, he obviously in the old Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing, firmly, whether he wanted it or not, art was absolutely at the top. And so he was just fiercely ambitious and creative and restless and always chasing the arts. And like another band I've written a lot about, Rush, you can at times be too enthusiastic about the latest shiny new object in the arts world and chase it, and then once you're in there as getting in early on something, it can end up dated later on, and it could look like you were just enamored with something that was trendy that didn't last. And so he's got records that do that as well, just being so in love with the arts sometimes will lead you wrong. But the neat thing about Bowie is that he just kept hammering and hammering and hammering away at it and put together this huge catalog of a multimedia love of the arts. He's just an artist where music happened to be one of the things he does, and he threatened to quit all along the way, at various times and tried acting, many times, and early on there was the mime thing and the ballet and all that kind of stuff. So literally, it's almost like as long as he's involved in the arts in some way, that is fine. And the fact that it was mostly music is almost like accidental.
For me, at least, the most enjoyable parts of the book were reading about the man David Bowie himself, life stories, experiences. For example, I think his first trip to New York and the States, he meets Andy Warhol, Lou Reed, and Iggy Pop, all within just a span of a few days. When you expect these group of people to get together, you'd probably are thinking extravagant and wild parties, but if anything, it was quite the opposite, quintessential of Bowie, because the endings from a lot of the stories in the book were actually unexpected in both big and small ways from where it began. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting time, that trip, because he's soaking it all in. He's definitely learning from these people, but now that you bring it up, I mean, I definitely feel, because I've been watching a lot of Warhol documentaries lately and reading about Warhol. I mean, he's an absolute factory. I mean, it's almost like his art. His art was Andy Warhol. People say that, and I mean, I know it's kind of trite, but his art was almost like, I mean, the greatest artwork he created was the idea of creating art. And to me, Bowie, that's probably the best lesson he picked up. But also at the same time, Lou and Iggy Pop were also guys that were somewhat all about the art, in terms of, I mean, they were creative, and the lyrics were usually good, and the package and the whole, not in particular the multimedia thing, but just the image of a strong persona. So that was there in those guys. But I would say literally Bowie went on to be the rock star that personified Andy's idea of the creation of art being his greatest work of art.
I actually didn't know this before the book, and probably shame on me, but David Bowie was second on Mark Chapman's list, who was killer of John Lennon.
He was putting on a performance thing. Yeah. So he was, so Mark Chapman, I think he was in the front row or something. And so, yeah, he was firmly in mind there as well, which is pretty wild. And then later on, we know that through various reasons, I mean, health scares and whatnot, but just, because he had put so much out there and caused so many strong feelings out there in the world about so many things, he definitely withdrew. Although people say that, he withdrew even, he liked the anonymity of being in New York City, but still he could walk around and do things in New York and people wouldn't bother him, sort of thing. I guess that's one of the things people say about New York. But no, it's you just got this feeling over time that he definitely didn't really need the spotlight so much. He just wanted to get on with doing the work. And the way he died, I mean, that in itself was a work of art, releasing that album at that point, and just quietly and just putting it out there, and it being such a great album at the same time. So yeah, it's all these things along the way, and all that fan adoration since probably the middle of 1972 throughout his whole life. After a while, you just build up an armor, I suppose, against it all. And you've heard it all before. You don't want to answer all the same questions before, so you just went around along quietly, had a family life eventually that was super happy, and just kept making art.
When I think of Bowie, I think, I guess the first words that come to mind are transformative and chameleon, and I guess maybe that's somewhat divergent, but what comes to your mind when you think about Bowie?
I'm not all that interested really in the different visual images, the fashion, the personas, as much as I am the albums themselves. I suppose what comes to mind the most is the crumpling it up and throwing it away, even though it's a successful direction, and then he just immediately wants to try something new. And that's why I think my favorite period is that whole low lodger heroes, scary monsters, that whole run in the 70s there that starts in LA and goes to Berlin and goes to Switzerland and then kind of goes back to New York, and you almost associate the places with all this. Philadelphia, with Young Americans and all that, right? Philly Soul or whatever. But I love that. I love that almost. I mean, he pretty much pioneered the synthetic drum sounds and the gated drum sounds and the synths all at the same time, when synths were just becoming new. And using them in new ways. I mean, he is one of the pioneers of that, which brings us to, punk from pure inspiration of fearless creativity, but post-punk again with the use of all those sounds, and then everything you got in the 80s kind of thing. And then I really love that later on, and a lot of artists do this, but later on, it just became after you fly through work and all the trends, and I think it got worse with albums like Tonight and Never Let Me Down, and then Earthling. I'm not a big fan of Earthling at all as well, where it was all the the electronica thing. But later on, the albums became, I'm a huge fan of the Hours album, which nobody likes. To me, I love that quiet acoustic sort of vibe. It's dark, it's analog, and all of those records later on, which are the ones that most people, the attention is sort of gone off them at that point. Your Heathens and Next Day and all that kind of thing. Attention was back for the last one, which is almost like a jazzy sort of krautrock album in a way. It's again kind of daring and weird, but yet it's still using conventional tools. So I love that whole last chunk at the end, all of those albums at the end, and then that other period that I spoke about with the synths and the drums and everything. And I'm definitely, I was never a big fan of Ziggy Stardust, and I get a lot of heck for saying that, or Mick Ronson for that matter. But even that whole period is not my favorite Bowie period. It's to me, it's, well, like I say, I think it culminates in Scary Monsters. So yeah, to me, it's about the records and working with cool people and making, super cool sounds and quite often pretty uncommercial sounds.
The evolution of his music, he adopted so many different styles, and he was so unique. And let me preface this next statement with I love AC/DC, but they are a fairly one-note band. And don't get me wrong, I do love that one note, but, Bowie could do anything. He made a freaking Christmas song with Bing Crosby, legendary. And I appreciate, and I'm glad that you brought up punk music before. I think that Bowie probably should be considered a little bit more influential on the sound of punk rock.
Yeah, not the sound, but more the inspiration just to be wild and crazy and do whatever you want and make art out of whatever. Because Bowie, that's the other thing he did all along his life is he would just pick up an idea and learn it, sort of thing. So he was good at that as well. But it's funny, you mentioned the word evolution and AC/DC, thinking of that whole thing. It's like a lot of artists evolve, and then a lot of artists like AC/DC do the one note thing, but Bowie is almost like he doesn't evolve. Essentially what he does is he just switches gears. There's just a few little records here and there that are an evolution of a previous one. And you can almost like group them into trilogies or two at a time or whatever. But then the door closes and he does something completely new. So he basically goes in and says, I'm going to be singing these things. I'm going to be writing these lyrics, but clean house on the musicians, or if the musicians are still going to be around, they better be the kind that can be complete chameleons like myself and change what they're doing at the same time. So yeah, it's funny. It's not really an evolution. It's literally it's just goes to a completely different place.
That's a pretty damn good point there. It reminds me of a quote from the book, and he really is a quote machine. But one of my favorites are, quote, "I'll do anything until I fail, and when I succeed, I quit too," end quote. And you can just tell when he was being interviewed that he really was a super sharp guy.
Yeah, and that idea about succeeding, like soon as you succeed at it, it's like he had a clear goal in mind, and he accomplishes it and realizes there's no real point to doing it twice. Although at times it seems like he did kind of do it again, as if maybe he didn't perfect it the first time. But yeah, I think it's that restless creative spirit to create and move very rapidly and be fearless about moving and not worrying about the consequences. Although maybe early on he learned that he could do that and he wouldn't particularly lose his audience. He'd lose some, gain some others. But yeah, he had lean years as well where things records weren't selling.
What I really appreciate about him is that he really liked to elevate future artists. Stevie Ray Vaughan, Luther Vandross, just two off the top of my head. He was really great at identifying new talent and sounds and gracious with the time that he allowed these newer artists to shine on his albums. Not a lot of artists of that ilk would probably do that.
Yeah, he liked to collaborate. I suppose he liked other artists. He liked people. He was always a very charming sort of interview kind of thing, right? But the one that comes to mind the most is Iggy Pop. I think I loved that. We also get the Idiot and Lust for Life out of that. Not so much blah blah blah. I'm not crazy about blah blah blah, but first of all, he does that actual work with Iggy and then creates these albums that fall into that. And then, out of Iggy's 20 record long catalog or whatever it is, those are considered, a couple of the greatest records that he ever did. That Berlin Berlin trilogy or whatever you want to call it, or four, it depends what you include, I suppose, is expanded because of the Iggy side of things. So, it's him. It's him, almost like reliving that early meeting with Andy Warhol and Lou Reed, and Lou Reed even, he guested with him at times, and they.
With his music, you could always tell what was inspiring him, but personally, he was a pretty private guy overall, especially later in his years, or really only knew so much about that aspect of him. There's a couple different passages in the book where it seems that his relationship with his brother Terry Burns, who committed suicide, had a huge impact on his life, both musically and professionally.
Yes, it disturbed him, and he was always had this ambivalent, probably slightly guilty feeling of not, keeping those family ties because he had to travel all over the place. And obviously he had, mental health issues. His brother did and eventually committed suicide, I believe, stepping in front of a train, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Close by at, commuter train kind of thing, subway. But and then he wrote about it later on in a song. But yeah, it definitely that definitely bothered him throughout his life. Being such a multi-dimensional human being, he wants it all, which includes family, which includes the blood family and relationships as well. But I think there was always somewhat of a guilt and a feeling that he had the curse of creativity. And, you hear rock stars sometimes use that as a get out of jail free card, that I'm a creative being. That's why I can burn bridges all over the place, whether they be business bridges or with your creative collaborators or with family of both types. So I think Bowie always kind of, had that curse of the creative person that realized that, not everything, when you're serving the god of art, when you're serving your muse, other things are going to suffer.
What's your take on Bowie's controversial statements about fascism and dictatorship?
That story was kind of a funny one where you think he's kind of believing this end of things because at this point, he's like, doing accelerant drugs, right? And he's not eating well, and he's skinny, and he's creating some of the most crazy, fearless art. So he's feeling like this odd sort of, and he's doing the Alien movie, right? The Man Who Fell to Earth. So he's doing all this completely bizarre Superman sort of stuff, and at that time as well. There was this fierce idea about work and working harder than everybody else and keeping strange hours, but keeping long hours and all this. So it all lines up into this package of being like the fascist leader of my own Andy Warhol creative factory during that time. So the fun and the look and the cocaine made him irritable and outspoken. So he spouts off a little bit in an interview and gets into trouble for that. But then he says that whole thing about the infamous wave from the car, right? And I think they were lit in an airport hangar or something for some reason, right? The car was inside in a building or whatever. And the way he explains it is that they caught me during mid-wave and it looked like I was given a Nazi salute, right? It was just the stupidest thing. It's like when you take a snapshot of someone and they're blinking, right? And maybe they look drunk or something like that, right? But so that thing he kind of waves off. But he does say these things, and he was a little bit of a an occultist / Nietzschean and all that sort of thing, right? All at the same time. He was a very learned, well-read guy. I can see him saying that stuff under the influence or having these things coaxed out of him, and he kind of goes to that place. But again, I think it's a little bit of that idea that at this time he was his own. He was running his own little almost like I don't know what you would call it, cult. I mean, it was almost like he was. And he didn't have a lot of disciples, but it was almost like he was a cult leader without disciples, and just running this whole very, very dark, creatively fearless enterprise during that whole California transition into Berlin scene.
Years later, in a Rolling Stones interview with Cameron Crowe, when he was asked does he stand by everything he said, Bowie's response was, everything but the inflammatory remarks. And you can just tell he was super sharp, and that's obviously a pretty funny guy too. And before you mentioned that he was a learned man, and a lot of his intelligence and prescience has shown through in the years. Specifically one of the things that I'm thinking of is that how he understood something like the internet and how it would have this huge impact on our lives at a time when people and journalists were easily dismissing such a thing. He really nailed it with that one too.
He spoke about it in interviews, and it is funny going back and looking at those, saying, man, this is going to change everything. And he'd even push back, right? There was that one famous interview with that, I think it was a British, a pretty high up British reporter. And the reporter was pushing back, saying, it ain't going to be much. And Bowie stops him and said, no, it is. You watch, he's listening to what these interviewers are saying. And he's not agreeing with them all the time.
I think I took away was how Bowie in his life was all about the art and the arts. And both his life and death were also a work of art.
Yeah, exactly. And even his death was his ultimate artwork. People call the last record their present that he's leaving behind or whatever. I mean, that's just a temporal thing, I suppose. But I mean, the main thing is just that whole act of having that album coming out and dying on cue and all this sort of stuff was a strange work of art almost in itself. But I think the most important thing to take away from that is that, even being super, super sick, he's making some of his greatest art, arguably his greatest art of all time, no matter how sick he is. So this is him showing that the priority is always art. I guess what you take away from that again is that there's only so many hours in the day, and if you devote your entire life to art, certain other things will suffer along the way. And health and family being, I suppose, the most obvious ones. But even things like, he ended up super wealthy, but for many artists, they won't even end up super wealthy. So what also they're giving up along the way is earning a decent income. And just doing a job that they don't like, kind of thing. So there's all these curses along the way to being an artist. And I think when you get to the end of Bowie's life, it wasn't a perfect life, but it was a super remarkable one for us from the outside. But again, the curse of the artist caused there to be these pretty large imperfections along the way.
The book, both the stories and the visuals, the pictures, the layout, I mean, truly is incredible. It is itself a piece of art too.
This publisher, I've done probably a dozen books or so for this publisher, Quarto Motor Books. They're just like a first-rate, top shelf publisher who turns in these beautiful finished products. Tell people where they can get the books and a little bit more information about you. So martinpopoff.com, you can find all the books there, and there's PayPal buttons for, Canada, international, and U.S. And my main income every year is literally being a mail order guy of my own books. So I'm always buying a stash of my own books. I've done about 115 books, and I'd say 80 or 90 of them are still in print. So I'm constantly signing and sending out books. And, the Contrarians and History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. So Contrarians is our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and put in the Contrarians, and I think we've done about 50 shows, and wherever you get your podcast, 40, 50 podcast locations, but I'm with Pantheon Podcasts. You can get History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and that I'm up to about 152 episodes. But I don't have a specific site for that or a specific site for Contrarians, just Facebook pages. But you can see all that stuff on YouTube. So, that's pretty much everything.
Martin Popoff, really appreciate you and giving us some time here to talk about Bowie at 75.
No worries. Thanks. This was a lot of fun, Brian. Thanks again.
I do have my copy right here next to me. It truly is gorgeous. I'm not just saying that. Normally I don't really talk about that part of the book, but it really just stood out to me. It really is gorgeous. And I appreciate you also for sticking around, for those longtime listeners or just here for the first time. I haven't produced that much content this year for this platform. But, like all of you, we got goals, and I've been been juggling on a few different projects, The Mind's Eye being the main one for the last, 8 years or so. Outside of this, never really fully committing to the other one. So it always felt like I was a mile wide and an inch deep on the other ones, and no penis jokes, please. So that I decided this year I kind of wanted to flip things around a little bit and really focus on this book that I've been writing for, this last several years, but only a little bit at a time, starting and stopping, because of the show and then, other life events. So that's what I've been doing this year, and I've been, making a pretty amazing progress. I'm a third of the way through the second draft, and if all things go right, it'll be published sometime next year. And I won't reveal everything, but I'll tell you a little bit about what the book's about. I'm writing about famous and not so famous ghost stories, paranormal tales, with Bigfoot and UFOs and other myths and legends from America. And it has a specific theme, and that, at least my research, hasn't been compiled in one book. So I think it's something that you're never really going to see before. A lot of what's in there in such a manner. So I really think you're going to enjoy it, and that explains where have I been. But again, to make it up for you, we got a hell of a bunch of next episodes over the next few months. You can go to the website, themindseyemedia.com. Again, you have to put in so themindseyemedia.com to see the full list. But on the next one, we're going to continue down the yellow brick road of nostalgia as we celebrate Elton John at 75, which he turns this year. And he's also doing a farewell tour, which I got to see earlier this year, and it was pretty great, even in such an age. So same exact idea for tonight for the next one, but with author Gillian Garr. Please join us for that one. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for The Mind.